So welcome back. This panel is, so Professor Beulah is in charge, and she just asked me if I was cool with whatever she did up here. Be very afraid. And the answer to that is, of course I am. All right. I guess I should introduce people. Dr. Elaine Nogueira-Godsey, who's on the end, is the assistant professor of, I'm going to get it wrong, theology, ecology, and race here at MTSO. She came to us from Brazil by way of South Africa, where she was teaching in a university setting for several years as a postdoc, and she now helps lead much of our work around ecofeminism, feminism, anti-racist work, and the like. So that's who she is, and therefore the reason she's on this panel. Professor Beulah is one chapter away from her dissertation. Yes, God, we're going to have us a party when that happens. Anybody who's ever finished a PhD, Susan, you know what I'm saying? It will deserve a party. But she has worked, she is native to this area, not technically to this area, but to Ohio. Her work is in history, particularly in Black church history, and she can say more about the particularities of even that. She is serving us now in an administrative and adjunct capacity. She's the administrative director of partnerships and helping us with our work with such entities as Payne Divinity School, and I can't even think, and a couple of programs that we are developing. And she's doing an excellent job of that. She is also adjunct professor in African Diaspora, African American Studies courses, and history. She's stepped in mightily this semester to pick up for one of our colleagues who needed to take a leave. And so I just want to say thank you to all of our colleagues who step up at the last minute when things happen that are beyond us. And so just thank her for pitching in for Dr. Labodi's Intro to History and Christianity and War classes. And I'm still Valerie.
She's still Valerie. Dr. Bridgeman, thank you for those very generous introductions. For those of you who would like to party with me, we can definitely party after schooler, because I turned in a chapter last week and I like to party every step of the way. So we'll certainly party. So what I would like to do for our panel discussion is to do the work of summarizing what we've heard. I would like to do the work of talking about some of the issues that came up and how we can use this in other areas of our lives, particularly as a historian. I'm hearing these things as a historian. So just some of the thoughts I would like to give to you around yesterday's main theme of translations matter. Okay, so I would like to talk about that a little bit more. And then today, what I took away from Dr. Gaffney's conversation was the use of a sanctified imagination. So I'd like to summarize that for her. And then we will move in and pick up with Dr. Elaine and just some of the insights that she's going to have from her perspective of race and ecology and theology. Does that sound good to you? Okay, very good. Did I miss something? In her work in feminist theology. My apologies. All right. So, really quickly, I want to start out by asking you all a question, okay? Do any of you all know what the 3/5 compromise was about in the U.S. Constitution? What? What is it about? Somebody? Okay. They're counted as 3/5 of a person? Okay. Is that the general consensus? Okay. So. Right? Right. Now, which slaves? Which slaves? No. Which slaves? Northern? That's a good one. They were there. They were there, contrary to popular opinion. Okay, so I'm no constitutional scholar, right? But as someone who studies race and religion, we have to be very careful about what the Constitution actually says. All right? And the Constitution actually doesn't use the word slave. Okay? What does it use? What is the euphemism that it uses? Nope, it uses other persons. It says white, Indian, and other persons. Right? And it doesn't necessarily say either that these people are counted as 3/5 of a person, as Reverend Rollins pointed out. But that is the general belief. One of my favorite rappers, her name is Rhapsody, and I highly recommend her last album if you haven't heard it. All right? So I love her, but she raps about the Constitution saying, oh, I'm just counted as 3/5 of a human being. And I'm like, oh man, sis, you didn't read. Okay? Because that's not what it actually says. It actually says what the sister right here says, is that we're going to count slaves at a ratio. So for every 3 white citizens, we're going to count 5 slaves for purposes of representation, right? And so yesterday, as I'm listening to Dr. Gaffney talk about what it means, and even Dr. Bridgeman talk about what it means to read the biblical text closely and carefully. Because what we say when we are proclaiming the word is very important, and it's important that we're giving these ideas, particularly as it reads in the text. It's like we also have to think about that in other contexts as well. You know, it's important for us to actually read these documents. We quote them all the time, but we don't read them. And so that was one carry away for summarizing what I heard yesterday. And then today, I'm glad she said it at the very end when she talked about the sanctified imagination, because she talks about it in the introduction to her book, and what it means to retell a particular story in a manner that makes it relevant and useful to the context in which people are living in, and how we fill in the biblical stories with these details. It was just a very important undersight that I wanted to underscore, and the importance of reading a book like Womanist Midrash, so that when we take these texts and we think about how Dr. Bridgeman brought in this beautiful point yesterday about being co-conspirators or allies with children. And I'm finding, I have a one-year-old godson who, if you ever stop by Chris's office and you're on campus, I'm usually in Chris's office talking about my adventures with King. He's about yay high, he's a big one-year-old. And I'm trying to teach him how to beatbox, okay? And I have video of our last lesson, and what I'm learning from King is that he's not going to attempt to beatbox as much as he's going to dance while I beatbox. And so I'll beatbox for a minute, and then I'll say, King, you do it. And he'll smile, and then he'll wait, and so I'll start to beatbox again, and then he breaks out into like this bounce, and it's a really cool bounce that he does. But it's like, in this give it and take with this boy, I realized, you know what, Tejai, you are just his track, and he is the baddest background dancer you'll ever have. So just do it. So all that to say is that particularly those of us who teach history, those of us who preach, it's very important to develop relationships with children, because they are going to be the ones who can carry these messages for us. And so it's very important that we develop our imagination in ways that which, when we start to give them these stories, that we fill it in with details that are very relevant to them, so that they can properly communicate it. Okay? So just in terms of summary, those are some of the insights I got, and we can push back on that, but I'm going to give Dr. Elaine a chance to speak, and then we can have some give and take on both of those perspectives, okay?
Thank you all for that. We're moving for a very thick Brazilian accent, and I hope you all can follow. Thank you for inviting me to be here, Dr. Bridgeman and Dr. Gaffney. It's been really an honor to be here with all of you. The work that I do in approaching, in working with theology and feminist theology, it is from a post-colonial ecological perspective. And thinking from a post-colonial perspective about race and about our positions in approaching the Bible, I find interesting that often when we speak from, when we hear people speaking from a humanist perspective or a Latin America perspective or a South African perspective, a lot of us are felt with the feeling, how do I do this work? Because I don't come from those places, and I don't have that race, and I don't have that cultural background. How do I apply those things? And the truth is, when you think about a post-colonial reality, is that we all are hybrids, and we all are experience the legacies of post-colonial. Independent if you come from a colonized space or a colonizing space, we are all here catching up with all of that. So a lot of times when Dr. Gaffney was responding to the questions made yesterday, she made me remember an experience that I had when I was a first-year master's student. So in Brazil, we first do 4 years of theology, and after that, you are then qualified to go for a master's. And I decided to do my master's in religious studies because I wanted to learn about religion from a social science perspective. And I did that in South Africa. And my first professor was a black South African man and he is a Methodist pastor, Dr. Sibusiso Masondo. And Dr. Masondo came to class in the first day, and I had recently graduated from a Baptist seminary in Brazil. And he comes to class wearing a huge ancestral necklace. And I thought, wow, how can this guy bring some things from the devil to the classroom? How is this possible? I was so shocked and I couldn't believe with that. But that was in my mind for a very long time. Now, here's the funny thing. My family is half indigenous. And I didn't put the two things together. But the second thing was, as the classes started to go, and the class was on Christianities of South Africa, he called me in his office and he asked me why I wasn't doing feminist theology. And I got so offended. And I thought, am I not intelligent enough to do real theology? Why is he asking me why I'm not doing feminist theology? But his question made me curious, and I realized that I didn't know what feminism was. So I went to research about feminism and gender. And as I started to research about, I was shocked of how I was ignorant about the reality of women and of women of color, and how ignorant I was from my own reality as a mixed hybrid from Brazil. So that experience brought very important lessons. One was that I should learn about my indigenous heritage, but it made me feel guilty. It made me feel guilty because my mother passed away, and she was the indigenous, when I was 11. And then I was raised by my white father. And I thought, should I research about that? Should I learn about that? Because I didn't live that. And the truth is, yes, we should learn about our heritage. We should learn, and especially the people of color in this room, you should learn and claim and take forward the heritage that you were born into. The second thing was that feminist theology, intersectionality, is just as much as theology as any other theology. And as Dr. Gaffney was pointing out the intersectionalities and how to approach the scriptures and how to bring the voices and the tools from feminism, there was some questions about how do we do this job? How can I bring this? And what about if not? And her answer was like, how can you not? And as she would answer one time after the other, how can you not? I would think, why is that seminary students tend to think that gender or ecology or race are an addendum to theology? How is that we come to think that classical theology is the real theology and all the other theology is addendum? If every time that we are doing theology, our subjectivity, our background, our race, our gender, our age, our class, it's always influencing our cognition, the way how we think. So I had already several students. This is my third semester in the school. We've been here for 1 year. And I already encountered several students. As Dr. Bridgeman said, I'm a professor that is covering ecology, race, feminism. And I have encountered students that I would ask, why are you not taking a class focused on gender? Or why you not take a class focused on ecology? And I have heard responses about that, oh, my ministry is not really focused on those themes. And I think, really? How? Don't you speak to women or men? Or don't you deal with this? And then immediately makes me think, this person doesn't know what it entails. When someone tells me, I don't really deal with ecology, I think this person doesn't know how economics influence knowledge. This person doesn't understand how politics manipulate knowledge. When a person tells me, oh, no, I don't need to take the queer theological ethics. I don't need to take the feminist theology class. I always think, it's clearly you haven't been challenged about those things. So it is a blind spot there. So thinking about this type of work and why an intelligent person, like all those women that is speaking to you now, have decided to specialize in such a topics, is curious. What is there that took people to actually dedicate their own life, the entire life, on that? What is the ethical questions challenging our own Christianity? How do we do this work without being an addendum, but be our lens? And why wouldn't us do it? Why wouldn't? So that question that Dr. Massondo made to me, why are you not a feminist theologian? It often pops in my mind. Why are we not a person bringing those things to the table? Thank you.
Well, yeah. Kind of everything that has already been said. One of the things that I often hear from students, not just here, but across the country, whenever I'm lecturing or preaching somewhere, is, what has that got to do with me? So mostly I hear that from white men, to be quite honest with you, if I can be totally honest in this space. Not that you were going to stop me, but in an effort to be totally transparent, I mostly hear from white men, but I hear it a lot from black men too. And then the next subset is black women, and then white women, kind of in that order. And partly because black feminism and womanist work has been demonized in black churches. And so black people are told that it's of the devil, and they don't love Jesus, so don't go nowhere near them. And so that, and partly from white men and white women who are feminists often will say, well, why do you need that black thing added? Can't we just all get along? They'll do the Rodney King thing on you. And without even recognizing how colonizing that is. And white men, just because they have been trained to believe that they're in charge of the world and they have the right to decide whether they're going to gift us with their care, no matter who the us is at the end of that sentence, whether it's people of color, whether it's people with differently abled bodies, because this is usually able-bodied white men, cishet gender men, cisgendered heterosexual men with power that will say this to me. Or as a student said to me in another school where I was teaching, when are we going to get to the real scholars? And by real, they meant Karl Barth and, you know, something like, preferably a man, preferably an old man, preferably an old German man, because that's, and a dead one at that, because they had been told that that's what qualified as, quote, real scholarship. So the notion that knowledge production and knowledge inquiry is happening constantly and all over the world in various institutions just goes over their head. So if you're feeling uncomfortable that I have made these distinctions, ask yourself why. Ask yourself why you are now uncomfortable around that. Because how do I respond to what? I was the teacher. I was like, I expect you to read what's on the syllabus. What? That's kind of how I responded. I mean, you know, I've had students choose to fail a class rather than read. I have. I've had white male students, not at this institution yet, but it'll happen here because it's inevitable. It has a kind of inevitability to it, huh? Say that again. Yes. Right. Yes. Yes. Sometimes you do need to use the tools of the master's house, the dominant culture, to make a point. I mean, if you're a student here, you know that I, as a black professor, don't like to be called by my first name. Part of that is I'm a woman of a certain age and from the South. Part of that is, I mean, we just don't do that where I come from. You just don't call an elder, I don't care who they are and how you feel about them, by their first name. You just don't do it. So it's my culture, and it ain't gonna kill you to call me Dr. V. It's just not gonna hurt you to form your mouth like that. But the other thing I've discovered is, and this is after 20 years of teaching, that I've really discovered that when particularly white students, particularly white male students, call faculty of color by their first name, they are dismissing their years of expertise, their years of study. They really are not thinking doctor in the background. They are not. You really are just your first name to that person. And I know there's always an exception. You're the but not me person. I don't need to hear that it's not you. But this is the history of the way this works. And when they call white men professors by their name, the doctor is silent. So they don't say Dr. Tim, but they're thinking Dr. Tim, you know, or Professor Tim, even if they call him Tim. So I'm like, no, you can't do it. And part of that is culture, and part of that is breaking the domination cycle as well. What has any of this got to do with preaching and preparing for it? When I was in Cuba, I went to the Museum of the Revolution in Havana. Did any of you who went to Cuba go to that? All right. So the whole time I was in that museum, I was thinking this African proverb, that until the lion writes the story, the hunter always wins. So the midrashic work that Dr. Gaffney is doing is forcing us to think about those parts of the story that we don't consider. Now, as a biblical scholar, I often say to students, the role of the editor in the Bible is to get you nodding like an insurance salesman. So the insurance salesman says, don't you want to protect your children? And you say, of course. Don't you want to live to be an old lady? Yes. Don't you want to make sure your children have what they need for education? Yes. Well, then this is what you need to make that happen. The role of the editor is to do the same thing the insurance salesman is doing, is just to get you nodding their yes. But if you've ever been in a room with a salesman that you don't intend to buy their product, it takes a lot to resist that. Well, didn't you just say you wanted to help your children? When you say I don't need that product, that doesn't work. The biblical text functions like that. And I think as preachers, sometimes we have to have a holy no even to the text itself. This is the problem of authority and that people lifted. But from where does authority come? If you are in history or in theology, you know the canon didn't just form out of the sky. It did not drop down, it didn't. There was a wrestling, there was a struggling, and there were a few prostitutes to help them bishops get that work done. Did I lie? Did I lie? Did I lie? I didn't lie. So, did I lie? I don't know. I was in seminary a long time ago. Did I lie? My point here is only as we are preaching, as we're thinking about these texts, one of the ways to use the work that Dr. Gaffney has done and other people who are not of the culture that you know is to read them, to dialogue with their work, as opposed to just saying, oh, that's just not me, because that's the easy thing. That's the easy thing. But to really wrestle with how do other people tell this story? Last thing I want to say, and I'm done, is when I went to the Whitney Plantation outside of New Orleans, it's the only museum plantation that is geared from telling the story from the view of the slaves, the people who were enslaved on that plantation. They are not slaves, enslaved on that plantation. It is one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had. It had the same impact as going to the museum in Cuba, is hearing the story from the people, reading the letters, reading the words from the people who suffered the oppression. Jeremiah Wright Jr. said, the Bible is the only document that was written by people under constant oppression. It is the loser's tale, but we tell it like it's a victory story.
So what I want to do for maybe the next 10 minutes is take maybe about 3 or 4 questions from the audience. And then in conclusion, I would like to return to the question that Dr. Bridgeman posed to us yesterday. Her first question was, how serious do we take this ministry? Okay, so we'll take a few questions from you all, and then we'll return to that question, okay? Now, y'all like to ask questions. I saw y'all yesterday.
In light of what you've all been saying, how do you think authority is being kind of reconstituted, re-understood today? Well, a preacher's authority, a teacher's authority, you know, as a woman in ministry speaking from the personal, the authority works differently. It's not that I don't have it, but it works differently. And I think like bell hooks, teaching to transgress, that some people argue we're in this Reformation where we don't know what the authority is anymore. It's not the Bible text. What is authority? It's something I struggle with a lot, is how it's being reconfigured.
Well, one way to answer that question, I'm thinking even about what I heard from Dr. V and Dr. Elaine in terms of the development of disciplines in the academy, for one example. You know, I argue with my advisor a great deal about why I still call my work African American religious history as opposed to calling it American religious history. Okay, and the argument there is that the reason why this branch of the field had to break off is because in American religious history, these stories are written primarily by white male scholars, and there is an absence there of people who look like me and who talk like me, and so we have to have this particular field. So now I'm becoming an authority in this particular field. So the authority is changing in that where we have these established ways of doing things, there's other voices that are coming in and making contributions as a result of our research and work and becoming authorities in the field in that particular way.
So
now,
while you use tools of the master's house, like you were just talking about, right? Is there also something else you bring that's changing the fundamental ground of how we do things?
I grew up in the era of hip hop, and I bring my hip hopness. I talk about what it means to develop that music, to develop that culture in my work, and I talk about it in a very gendered sense. So there's that unique blend there. I bring my youthfulness, so that's a great deal of hip hop culture. So there's different ways in which I, as a unique individual with my own particular interests, are bringing that into spaces where someone might look down on me and say, well, maybe she shouldn't say that in class, but I will preface an email with y'all because it's like, hey, what's up? You know, there's just different ways in which I I don't attempt to minimize who I am. And I can, yes, please. And I still am able to yield my authority in that particular space. Please speak to that.
So, continue the question. While Dr. Bridgeman was speaking about the resistance from white men to feminist theology, I was thinking, I have been teaching feminist theology probably for the last 7 or 8 years, and I get not as much, but in a very high level of resistance from women. So in a lot of the classes on feminist theology, there is a great form of resistance in reconstructing theology, of rethinking the theological task. What is theology for? You know, how can we liberate? How can we move on? How can we give voices for this? And often, it comes down to authority. Who are the authority to say that it's okay to think differently? And what about the fear of thinking differently and that is not according to God's will? What about if that is the real revelation, the one that we had up to now, because it's been up there for so many years, right? What about if what we are doing now, it's actually offensive? So the question on authority, on inspiration, on revelation, on what has been done and why are we changing, it is constantly there. But if we don't pay attention to the ways how what is there is oppressive and has been oppressing and has been silenced and has been told from one side of the story, anywhere you go in the world, it's going to be told from one group or another. If we don't give the chance for the other side to bring their voices, to the lion to tell the story, how will we know what's the consequences? And if God is benevolent, and if God is all love, as we like to say, so wouldn't God understand that? That people are trying to figure out the most liberating way, even if that is a mistake? So definitely to question the authority. And who are the people questioning why should we go this side or not? Who are really the people questioning the authority? That is another good question. Who are the people telling you that you shouldn't do this way or that way? And question if you are doing right or not, that's another good question.
So the good thing about And I really actually mean the word good. The good thing about white supremacy and patriarchy and sort of hierarchical ways of keeping systems in place is systems are invisible. I mean, the whole point of the matrix is it's invisible. It's like the water if you're a fish, the water you swim in, for us, it's the air you breathe. So racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, it literally is in our air. We don't even notice when we're doing it. So part of the challenge always for preachers and others, and I think of every preacher as a public theologian. If you are preaching in the morning to 10 people or 10,000 people, you are shaping their theological worldview. You are therefore a public theologian. That's a little scary. But part of the task is to unmask the system. And then people can decide whether they want to take the blue pill or the red pill. If you didn't see the Matrix, I can't help you. But you get my point. Your job, my job, is this kind of Morpheus job to unmask the Matrix, to show us how it's keeping us dumbed down, how it's keeping us not alive, how it's keeping us in these sort of unfaithful ways of being human in the world, or humane, because I actually, as a Christian, believe that the role of Christ was not to make us godlike, as I grew up in the evangelical holiness tradition. That was what I was pretty much taught. They didn't use that language, but it was close enough. But really to make us fully human. What does it mean to be humane? And to deeply believe that every human is us. But the system keeps us from that, because the system really makes us believe that there is not enough. And at the core of all of this system is scarcity and fear.
I always think that I am in a choir in an allegorical sense, which means that I've been preached when I'm in a choir singing. I have a question about more like intra-religious dialogue, not so much about inter-religious. As we hear in the State of Union, when someone point out African American unemployment, it wasn't really spoken in a flattering way. And when we hear someone said it's treasonous when you don't clap your hand, and we hear someone who asks Dr. Ben Carson to say prayer for the cabinet, and I don't think that was also trying to flatter. But they do believe that they are very religious. They do feel that they have of a same faith as some, but they have very different interpretations. And if we keep focusing on, well, like someone like me, which I have been singing in the choir, it might not really create that intra-religious dialogues. And if they don't care about what we think and what we wanted to discuss, I don't know if you follow what I'm saying, is that there are people who could be very religious and yet very racist. And how do we, as part of a religious group, to handle this problem?
I realize that my work has a particular audience, and at some point it is difficult to engage with people who believe in their own sense of superiority, their own sense of entitlement, and I know that my work is not for them. And I realize you can't be in communion with everyone you seek to be in communion with, because they're just, for lack of a better word, hell-bent on being who they are. And so sometimes it's best to leave them to their delusions. That's one way of looking at it. You have another way of looking at it, I'm sure.
She's like, no. Let me just talk about this as a preacher, somebody who pastored across denominations and across racial, each congregation that I had primary care of was a multiracial congregation, and they were also kind of all over the spectra as far as, quote, doctrine. I actually don't like that word anymore. But part of the challenge is the people that you are worried about are not going to dialogue with me anyway. And I used to worry about them. I used to wring my hands and cry at night for them. And then I came to this, I won't even call it a conclusion, because this is where I am today. Because where I might be 10 years from now is someplace entirely different. And I hope that just taught you something right there. But I came to, my job is to tell the truth as best I know it today, and live the truth as clearly as I can today, and to take this journey with God and to make the turns when God makes the turn. Like what I often say to students is, believe what you believe, but hold it loosely enough so that if God reveals something different to you, you are able to let that go so that you can move on. If you are so invested, and you in this sentence is me included, in what I currently believe, that means that I am closing off knowledge and learning that I'm not even open to. Now, it would take a lot for you to convince me to go back where I came from, because I'm not going back, because I know how damaging that was to my soul. And I do know the difference between people who are homophobic or anti-LGBTQ and people who are not. And this is what I learned. People who believe it's just, quote, a lifestyle and you're making a choice, treats it like, oh, you could just lose weight, as opposed to you're 5'2". You're not going to grow anymore. You know, so the difference in those two understandings, this is your height, over, oh, if you really tried really hard, you could lose weight, which also may not be true because of other things. That fundamentally, unless you can see that people are, no, this is actually about height and not weight, that's not going to change. So I learned that conversation, I just had to quit having that conversation with people and say, here's where I stand and here's what I believe. So I think part of the intro discussion is here's where I stand and here's where I believe and here's why. The telling of story is way more effective than holding on to doctrine. And that's true whether you're preaching or whether you're in a teaching session. Now, my example of this, and this is the last I want to say about this, and I use LGBTQ issues very specifically just now, because I know where the United Methodist Church is right now. In a federated church in Seattle, the pastor, one of the young members came and said, I just don't believe in those gay people. And she said, okay, that's fine, but I want to invite you to be in one of our learning cubits, they call it. And so he went and they met in the garage, and it turns out that these two men were hosting it. They were lovers, they were partners, and active members of the church. And so she said, just stay with them for the whole unit. So 6 months. So at the end of 6 months, he said, I actually don't know what I believe anymore, but I believe they know Jesus. I mean, so the notion of relationship and story does way more than doing scriptural badminton, whether we're talking about queer people or queer theology or race even. It does way more than this ping pong thing we do where we say. Now, I think it is deeply important for people who are marginalized or minoritized to tell their story in the midst of dominating culture. It humanizes, it displaces dominating culture, it equalizes or does more to make equal the room. That's why it's important to keep telling the story as a person made into a minority. Consider what I am even saying. There's no such thing as white, but there's a, quote, white culture. And so white culture is actually the minority culture in this country. But you can't tell from our pulpits or from our grocery stores.
We're going to take one more question, we'll conclude, and then we will get you to lunch on time so we can get through chapel on time, okay? So one more question. All right.
I'll ask this question, and then I'll actually even go to lunch. I'll probably be scared, though. For me as a male, sometimes the womanist and the feminist seem harsh. It just seems harsh at times. And I wonder, how do we soften the message to include it so that we don't end up doing the same thing in reverse, making the men feel like we're on the outside? How do we, yeah, I'm going to so I'm still trying to understand how we bring it full circle. How do we get to a place of inclusive thought and interpretation and such and such? Or are we not trying to get there at all? I'm just kind of trying to understand how that works. How do we end up at the same table and still find a place of peace?
There are no people here that say that they are womanist here. No womanist identified men. There are no womanist identified men here. I actually have I have a former student colleague who says I am womanist identified. His name is Earl Fisher. If you go to Proctor, you're going to meet him. He works with us. There are plenty of feminist men who do this work. The answer to your question is the goal has always been is to make wide the table and to put the dinner on the table. When you say it comes across as harsh, I'm sure that's true. Because sometimes the truth hurts. And oftentimes when white people are being called on the carpet about racism, when men are being called on the carpet about sexism, when cis heterosexual people are being called on the carpet about their homophobic, antagonistic behavior, we are asked to take care of their feelings rather than the very harm that these systems have done to the people that that's being called. So the question, and I'm quoting Earl Fisher now, that womanist identified man, should we take care of the feelings in the room or the real harm that the system has done? I mean, then you work on your feelings, right? Then you work on your feelings.
And I just want to say that anger is not the absence of love.
Right.
That if someone is being angry, it shows what they love and what they care about. I care about black people. I care about black women. I care about the oppressed. And so if I'm expressing anger in a moment, it's not about me being harsh. It's about me expressing what it is I love and what I want to see change. So I want to add that before you add whatever you'd like to add to that question.
I would end in the same note as Dr. Bridgeman says, that we should take care of the feelings in the room that the oppressive system has done to cause harm. We don't like to be the people that bring bad news. We don't like this. If you have the same personality of me, you'd rather have someone stamp on your foot than actually be the one that will bring hard news or will break the truth. Because I empathize so much when people are hurting that I will, if I have to tell you something hard, I will immediately want to be hugging you and take care of your feelings and don't allow you to cry. But this job has been put on women throughout centuries. And does women have the right to be angry? It comes to my mind something that Stephen Biko, a South African activist, said long ago, that black people has now been awakening for the oppression that they were going through. And who are those that want to tell the black people how to say and how to manifest and how to express their anger? The way how we going to manifest our anger, Stephen Biko continued, it's our problem. And if we're going to make mistakes, it's also our turn to. And then we will learn with our mistakes. And we will continue. And I remember me taking that saying and bringing to my gender class and saying this is very similar to gender. The way how women has been angry for the lack of opportunity, yes, it might come out as harsh. And yes, it's difficult to deal with all the feelings around, but the priority is to take care of the harm be done by the system. That is our priority. And then people have the opportunity to deal with the feelings and so on. But if we care, if we prioritize their feelings over deconstructing a system, we're never going to get anywhere. You know.
It's the same thing as it's what Martin Luther King Jr. did in Letter from a Birmingham Jail to the white moderate, right? He basically said, y'all more of a problem than the Klan, because you're just going too fast. You're causing all this. Can't we just all get along? There has to be a way to do this so that people aren't upset. But Frederick Douglass told us, you can't get freedom without a demand, including women and people. You can't get freedom without a demand, and demands are harsh. James Cone, last quote, said to us in a lecture, he said, somebody got up and said, why won't men let women get in the pulpit? It was a Baptist church. And he said, because women won't storm the pulpit and take over it, and they won't walk out and quit tithing. He said if women quit tithing for 1 month, men would get a revelation. And then he said, don't believe me because I'm a man. Just see, don't trust even me because I'm a man.
Right. Well, to my co-panelists, are all hearts and minds clear? Are you all clear? All right. So I want to return to Dr. Bridgman's question from yesterday, her first question. How serious do we take this ministry? And I want to charge all of you to be serious enough to take your ministries to, one, to be uncomfortable, to make other people uncomfortable, and to develop courage. Maya Angelou said that of all the virtues, courage was the most important because without it, you couldn't practice any other virtue consistently. So take your ministries seriously enough to develop courage, all right? Enjoy your lunch. All right.
And please come back to worship with us to finish schooler together. Please come back for worship. Dr. Will is going to preach what she has been practicing.